Hi everyone, it's Artcell Illustrations here today, and I'm going to be showing you how I draw a realistic eye. This tutorial will be pretty beginner friendly, and if you want to follow along with me, all the supplies and free brushes I'm using will be in the description below. Making a realistic drawing can be broken down into 3 general steps. No, not that. The ones I'm going to walk you through today are 1. Finding a good reference, 2. Creating some sort of sketch based off that reference, and 3. Rendering the sketch until you like how it looks. To find a reference, I'm looking on upsplash.com for an eye. When I draw realistically, quote unquote, I don't go for photorealism or an exact copy of the image. I use references as kind of like an idea of what I want my drawing to look like, and then I add little details that make the image my own. I'm looking for an image that's dynamic, one that has a unique lighting situation or a lot of contrast, something like that. This is the image I've chosen, and now let's get started on the sketch. I'm using the program Procreate on my iPad, but the techniques I'm showing you here can be used in any program. First, I'm importing my reference photo, and if you want to make your life easier, make the canvas size the same as your reference. It'll really help you in the end. Before I make my actual sketch though, I create these guidelines on a new layer to show the proportions between different parts of the eye, like from each end of the eye, the middle of the iris, where the outside and the inside edges meet the eyebrow, and so on. Now I've just exported the image with the guidelines and opened it in the canvas reference to look at while I sketch. I use sketching as notes to myself for when I color later. For example, I point out where the major shadows and highlights are. I'm pretty loose with it because I don't like worrying too much about if my sketch is exactly like the reference, because I'm going to be coloring it in later. I mean now. We're actually coloring now. To start out, I'm picking a mid-tone from the reference, and on a new layer, I'm filling in the whole canvas with this color. This is going to act as our base for when we color in everything else. Then we fill in the water lines with brown, but I'm using more of a pinker brown as the base for the bottom water line. To render the skin, I'm paying attention to where the darkest shadows are and also where the major highlights are. These have the sharpest edges and the highest contrast. I personally find that doing multiple rounds of coloring and blending kind of gives more depth to the drawing and makes it look more realistic, because human skin is not really like plastic, like a doll. Everything's not just one flat color, and that all contributes to the different hue and saturation variations that skin has. I'll go more into that in a bit, but first I want to talk a little bit more about my technique. When I paint, I kind of slap some paint on the canvas and then blend it out with a blending tool. That being said, to achieve a more painterly and realistic effect, it's important to not overblend and use brushes that have texture and aren't completely opaque. In areas where the sunlight is shining directly on the skin, right where we have the deepest shadows, there tends to be a saturated reddish-orange line that separates the shadow from the light part. This is called subsurface scattering, and it's basically when the light shines through the skin and bounces off the red blood vessels inside, and it shows up as a saturated warm tone on the surface. To show this, I'm selecting a really saturated orangey color, and I'm making a line right next to where the shadow is, and then I'm going to take my blending tool and blend it out. And see, that looks way more realistic already. I'm going to come back to work on the skin more later, but right now I'm going to work on the eyeball itself. On a new layer, I'm using the selection tool in freehand mode and selecting all of the eyeball area. I'm trying to be as precise as possible because this is going to be our base for coloring the eye. Then I'm going to fill in the selection with a light bluish color because the whites of our eyes aren't pure white, they have a bluish tinge to them. And then I'm carving out the spherical shape of the eyeball by adding and blending out a darker shadow color around the edges and a white in the middle. I'm doing this in layers, kind of like a mini version of what I did with the skin. And if you blend with the curvature of the eye, it really helps sell this is a 3-dimensional object, kind of like you're shading in a sphere. Now I'm doing the same thing for the iris, but this time filling it in with black. My strategy for coloring the iris is basically the same as the skin. I'm using a variation of lighter and darker blues and greens to carve out the highlights and the shadows in the iris. You always want to work from areas of greatest detail to areas of low detail. Notice that I'm coloring and blending from the pupil outward. This makes the starburst inside of a kiwi pattern that you see in the reference picture. And because I'm working on this in different layers, the iris isn't going to be as bright in the reference until I add the highlights at the very end, so stay tuned for that. And to add the eyelashes and eyebrows hairs, I'm using Kadir's lash brush, which again is linked below. Eyelashes kind of clump together in this triangle shape, and they're further thicker near the waterline. Here I noticed after all this that I accidentally did my coloring on the same layer as my sketch, and I'm not at all salty that I have to take the time to extract it.
I'm fine! fine, totally fine.
Okay, so that's fixed, and now it's time for another round of coloring. The goal of my final round of rendering is to deepen shadows and emphasize highlights. To add even more texture to the skin, I like to blend with a noise brush or another skin texture brush. This prevents the skin from looking too doll-like and plasticky like what I was talking about earlier. And for those juicy highlights, I'm using a layer set to add and following the reference for the shape of the highlights. Don't be shy to work with what I call quote-unquote non-traditional colors. These are colors that when layered together give the impression of the main color that we see and overall add depth to your painting. For example, if we just use different shades of brown, the skin won't look very lifelike. That's because there's shades of purple and blue and green and pink and yellow, and they all contribute to the overall color that we observe. The outer corner of the eye is more yellowy and brighter because the sun is hitting directly on it. Near the inner corner and the skin under the eye that's in shadow, it has a bit of a bluish tinge. Sometimes this part leans more purple or green. Now for the final details. I'm painting the eyebrow hairs in the direction that the hair is going in, and this is why it's important to have a reference to kind of see how that looks. Also, like when you draw head hair, you don't really need to paint every single hair strand, just enough to give the general idea that there's hair growing here. To add the freckles, it's like when we did the skin, play around with the opacity of layers and blend the freckles out so it looks more realistic and less like random dots. You might need to do multiple freckle layers until you're happy with how it looks. And if you're anything like me, you'll continue to overwork it until you don't like the painting anymore, but then you come back the next day and realize that it looks awesome. And here is the final piece. Today I showed you my process of how I draw a realistic eye on Procreate, from creating a sketch to rendering out the image. And if this video helped you, please let me know by clicking the like button below. And if you have any other tutorials you'd like to see, tell me in the comments down below as well. Okay, I'm gonna go now, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!